Now, as I've said before, since we've spent so much time in Matthew, it's hard for me to know what to say about Mark. And partly I have to confess that's me, that I don't know as much about Mark, but it's also that when you read through Mark, if you've already walked through Matthew in a very careful way, as I've said, almost everything that's in Mark is there. And so I hope Mark doesn't punch me in the face when I get into the new creation, that I'm not giving him as much airtime, but I love you, Mark, I love you, Mark, I love you, Mark. But we don't have as much to say about this, and that's okay. We can do other assignments to work more in detail. You'll still do closer reading passages, etc. I just want to point out three things about Mark. Okay, land in three places, really land in two places, then make some summary statements. The first place I want to land is in chapter 8 of Mark, verses 22 through 26. Let me read these for you. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not enter the village." Now, we've probably heard that story before, and we're also used to Jesus' healings, but if you just kind of read that afresh, you realize this is an odd story. It's an odd story for a number of reasons. One is that Jesus spits and heals the man through putting mud and spitty hands on him. It just seems an odd thing, instead of just, because obviously we know that Jesus can just heal from afar. For example, he does that with the centurion's servant and others. And also, especially troubling about this story, or not so much troubling, but odd about it, is that he does it in a two-part miracle. It's almost like Jesus didn't quite do it right the first time or something, which is obviously not what we would understand from anything else in the Gospels or the New Testament. So what's going on in this story? Well, when you see things like that are odd, it should at least invite us to ask the question, what's going on here? What else might be being communicated? And I think when you read Mark as a whole, this unique story to him is a very interesting one that reveals something very important. Particularly, this is a figure or an allegory. You may not like that word, and I don't mean by that it didn't historically happen. What I mean is it serves a figural purpose for something else. I would suggest to you that it's a figure or metaphor for the idea of the developing understanding of the disciples. Now, this is something we saw in Matthew, that the disciples are depicted as ones who understand but don't understand. I think Mark does that in a very interesting way in this unique story to him that is depicting it in a very physical way, so that we see from this man who's healed in Bethsaida a picture of what our lives are like as disciples, particularly that Jesus touches him and he partially understands. He sees from being blind to seeing. That's a major change. But he sees men like trees walking. And that's not a reference to Lord of the Rings or something. Instead, it's saying he doesn't quite understand. And then when Jesus touches him again, then he sees clearly. Again, this is not a statement about Jesus' inability to heal or his wrong amount of spit in the recipe or something. The point is, this is metaphorical. It's historical, but it serves a metaphorical purpose, which is to say we as disciples grow in our understanding as Jesus gives us the ability to do so. As we grow as disciples and Jesus touches us, we grow in our understanding. I just like to highlight that because that theme is not only in all the Gospels, what I like to call a theological epistemology, but it's especially highlighted for Mark because of his idea of the disciples being depicted as ones who stumble and fall and fail and don't always understand, which is something Mark really wants us to see, and I think that beautiful little story helps depict that. The other thing that's unique about Mark that we should definitely say something about is the famous ending, not only how it ends, but also how the odd ending of Mark results in some problems in what we call textual criticism. Particularly, as far as we can tell, the for sure last verse of Mark, and I mean by that, the last verse that we know for sure was written by him, there may have been other verses as well, is 16:8. And let me read this for you at the very end of his gospel. It's after the resurrection, there's the appearance of the angels, and verse 8 says, "And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." That's kind of an odd way to end the gospel. It's an odd way to end the gospel in English. It's even a more odd way to end the gospel in Greek because it says ephobunta gar. That is, they were afraid for. I mean, it's a very odd thing to say. And the very fact that the disciples are depicted as fleeing in fear and misunderstanding is terribly odd. Now, in some sense, it's not, in the sense that this is a major theme of Mark, but you can understand why a lot of people felt like maybe we need to add an ending to this, okay? And I don't mean by that they wanted to add an ending in the sense of like corrupt the Word of God or something, but we know of at least 3 inspired people that felt like they needed to add something to it: Matthew, Luke, and John, right? I mean, they probably had Mark, almost certainly did, and yet they needed to add more. They don't end their gospel that way. And at the same time, we also know that there are a lot of other people that did too, faithful Christian people, because we actually have several different endings of Mark that are probably not original, but are very, very early. And and this is what you'll see in your English Bibles as well as in your Greek text, you'll see a few different versions of these possible endings. Now, it may be that Mark actually ended the story there in this kind of odd way, and then people felt a need to kind of tie up the loose ends. Or it may be that Mark did have an ending that was lost. Either way, we know from the very early days, people felt a need to explain that this very odd ending to the story had a little bit more resolution to it, probably especially in light of things that they had read in Matthew and other places. So what you have in various manuscripts after this, in what we call 16:9 and following, are a whole bunch of different manuscript endings. We know again that 16:8 is the best attested ending, but you also have these longer endings in some of the manuscripts, but in some of the earliest manuscripts, they're not there. And in fact, I've seen some of these earliest uncials, they're called, from the 4th and 5th centuries, one with the longer ending and one without. It's very clear that it's very debated from the early days. When you look at those later endings, the vocabulary is pretty different. They don't always flow very nicely. And so it's a difficult one on a textual variant kind of level. You'll see in your English Bibles usually some very helpful notes to say most early manuscripts do not have these endings. And so just some options for helping understand this again. Maybe Mark didn't finish his gospel and it was distributed. Maybe Mark had an ending that was lost or destroyed. Maybe, again, the suspended ending is intended. Either way, what we can be confident of is through 16:8, and we can be confident that, of course, that's not the only gospel we have. We have more of the story in Matthew, Luke, and John. So we don't have to be worried. We can just let Mark speak what we have in the best manuscripts and let it be that, is how I'd handle this. Now, I wouldn't talk about that so much in the pulpit because I think that might be confusing to people. But with a semi-educated group of people or in an adult Sunday school situation, you can read in commentaries and textbooks, including your textbooks, some information about this that would help explain it in a simple enough way. Okay, final thing to say in this all too brief overview of Mark is just to sort of make a couple of comments about the overall impressions that I get of Mark, and it's a good exercise for yourself as well to say, what are the overall impressions you get? And I have 3 main impressions when I read Mark. First, that Jesus is shockingly powerful. Now, I love Matthew. I love the elaborate literary elements of Matthew and Luke and the teaching elements, but there's something in an odd way that Mark communicates by not having all that teaching and elaborate dialogue with Jesus and others, and that is that you get the strong sense of Jesus' power. There's a sense in which when you read Matthew, Luke, and John, because they give us all that other great information, the edge of Jesus' shocking power, his conquest over this world, is kind of lost. But Mark, by his quick, powerful, get in, get out, kind of SWAT team version of Jesus, you sense that Jesus is powerful over demons, over nature, over his opponents as well. So the shocking and powerful Jesus. Secondly, the opposite of that, the weak and foolish disciples, just like you and me. I think in contrast to that, Mark paints a more robust picture of the brokenness and foolishness of humans in contrast to Jesus, including the disciples. And the third and finally, the cruciformity of the gospel, I should say. That Mark, with his great emphasis on Jesus' looking forward to his death, and then his death and his resurrection certainly, but especially his death being such a focus, you get a strong sense of the fact that the gospel is cross-shaped, that what Jesus came to do was to die on behalf of his people, and as disciples that we are called to take up that life of suffering and to take up our crosses as a metaphor for Jesus' suffering and death, dying to self, living in service to others. The greatest among us must be the slave of all. And Jesus is depicted in that way in Mark in such a powerful and shocking way.